August 8, 1943. The coastal road north of Santo Stefano, Sicily. The lead elements of the 3rd Infantry Division are moving at night, in the dark, past the blown bridges and the cratered road surfaces, and the forward positions of the German 29th Panzergrenadier Division's rearguard, at a pace that the German rearguard commander says no American unit should be capable of sustaining in this terrain after 29 days of continuous operations. The soldiers are exhausted in the specific and documented way that 29 consecutive days of Sicilian summer combat produces in soldiers who have been given no rest and no operational pause since the landing on July 10th. The dust of the Sicilian interior, the pale limestone dust that coats every piece of equipment and every soldier's throat and settles on the vehicles and the weapons and the faces of the men in a layer that the August heat bakes into the specific and miserable film of a battlefield that never gets clean, has been the constant companion of the campaign since the landing. The heat has been exceeding 100 degrees in the inland terrain and dropping only marginally at the coast, where the Tyrrhenian's August sun reflects off the white cliffs and produces its own specific version of the same heat, whose effect on soldiers in full combat kit is the effect that the medical records document as heat exhaustion, dehydration, and the specific and accumulating physical degradation that sustained physical activity in extreme heat produces in the human body, regardless of the training that has prepared it for exactly this condition. The 3rd Infantry Division, under Major General Lucian Truscott, has driven from the American landing beaches in the southwest of Sicily to the northern coast in 12 days. 12 days of the specific and operational achievement that includes the capture of Palermo and the swing east along Route 113, the single road that clings to the cliffs above the Tyrrhenian Sea between Santo Stefano and Messina, and that provides the only viable axis of advance toward the northeastern corner of Sicily, where the Strait of Messina and the city that overlooks it constitute the operational objective whose capture will end the Sicilian campaign. The division is now pressing against the defensive positions that the 29th Panzergrenadier Division's rearguard has been establishing and abandoning and re-establishing in the specific and professional rhythm of an elite German formation executing the most demanding of military tasks. The fighting withdrawal that preserves the formation's cohesion and combat effectiveness while making the pursuing force pay for every kilometer of ground it gains from each successive defensive position. The German assessment of the American pursuit's pace has been consistent and professional throughout the campaign. The Americans cannot sustain this rate of advance in this terrain. The terrain is too difficult. The coastal roads, cliffs and tunnels and switchbacks create the specific and operational conditions that favor the defender with demolitions and blocking positions and restrict the attacker to the single road whose clearance each position requires. The rearguard is too professional. The 29th Panzergrenadiers' formation quality and its knowledge of the terrain produce the maximum available defensive effect from the minimum available force. The road is too vulnerable to demolition and blocking positions whose preparation the German engineers have been executing since the campaign began. The American army will slow, and every time the German professional assessment says the Americans will slow, the 3rd Infantry Division continues at the pace that Truscott has been demanding since the campaign began. The pace that the Truscott trot produced in the training areas, and that 5 weeks of Sicilian combat has been converting from a training standard into an operational capability, whose demonstration is rewriting the German professionals' assessment of what the American army can do. The race to Messina is not simply a race between two Allied armies, the American 7th Army pressing along the northern coast, and the British 8th Army fighting around the base of Mount Etna on the eastern coast, competing for the honor of first entry into the city that will conclude the Sicilian campaign, and whose capture will mark the end of the Axis presence on the Mediterranean's largest island. It is a race between the American operational capability and the German professional assessment of what that capability can produce, between what the 3rd Infantry Division can do and what the German rearguard's planning projects it should be able to do in the terrain that the northern coastal road provides as the operational environment. It is a race whose prize is not merely institutional pride or the photographic opportunity of Patton standing at the Messina waterfront with the Strait of Messina behind him and Italy 3 miles across the water. The prize is the operational validation of an American army whose capabilities have been consistently underestimated. By the German professional who reads the Kasserine Pass reports from February 1943 and concludes that the American army is not yet ready for the primary mission in any theater where the Wehrmacht's professional quality will be the opponent. By the British professional who builds the Husky plan with the American 7th Army in the supporting role and the British 8th Army driving toward Messina, because the British professional assessment of the two armies' relative capabilities produces the assignment of the primary axis to Montgomery's formation. By the institutional assumption that the American soldier's democratic upbringing and individualistic cultural formation produces a military culture incapable of the sustained operational excellence that the best European armies have been developing through the systematic cultivation of the professional military tradition since the 19th century. The 3rd Infantry Division is racing toward Messina on the single road that connects Santo Stefano to the strait, the road whose cliffs and demolitions and blocking positions have been the 29th Panzer Grenadiers' instruments of delay since the division swung east from Palermo. The German rearguard says the Americans will not arrive first. The race's outcome will answer a question that the entire Allied coalition has been asking since Tunisia. Since the Kasserine Pass's humiliation produced the professional assessment that has been shaping the Allied command's calculations of what the American army is capable of ever since. Major General Lucian Truscott, in the summer of 1943, is the American Army's most demanding troop trainer, the creator of the Truscott Trot, the 5 miles per hour march pace, faster than the standard Army march of 2.5 miles per hour, that Truscott has been imposing on the 3rd Infantry Division since taking command in 1942, and that has produced in his soldiers the specific physical capability for sustained rapid movement that the Sicilian campaign's northern coastal drive is now requiring. He is 48 years old, a cavalry officer whose career has taken him from the interwar army's horse soldiering through the Command and General Staff School and the specific professional development of the interwar period's officer class, to the modern mechanized warfare whose demands he has been reading and preparing for since the late 1930s, reading in the German operations in Poland and France, whose pace and whose combined arms character he has been analyzing as the model of what the modern army at its best looks like in operation. He is profane, demanding, and personally present in the forward positions in the specific and documented way of a division commander who believes that his physical presence at the point of decision communicates the operational priority, whose communication no radio transmission can replicate, who has been walking the forward positions since the campaign began, driving to the lead battalions in the specific and characteristic way of a commander who needs to see the ground and be seen by the soldiers whose pace he is demanding, whose presence at the front tells his soldiers more about the operational priority than any radio order can convey. He is also the commander who is being given the impossible mission by General George Patton, the commander who wants Messina before Montgomery's 8th Army arrives there from the south, and who has calculated that the only way to get there first is to drive the 3rd Infantry Division at a pace that the terrain and the rearguard and the professional military's standard calculation say is not achievable. The relationship between Patton and Truscott in the Sicilian campaign is the relationship between the operational commander who sees the strategic prize and the tactical commander who must figure out how to reach it. The relationship between Patton's competitive urgency and Truscott's professional precision, between the general who wants the pace and the general who must provide it from soldiers whose finite physical resources are the limiting factor that Patton's operational ambition is always pressing against. It is a productive relationship, in the specific sense that the Sicilian campaign's operational record documents. The competitive urgency and the professional precision together produce an operational outcome that neither alone would have generated. Patton without Truscott would have driven the 3rd Division to exhaustion and breakdown at the pace whose maintenance requires the specific and physical foundation that Truscott's training produced. Truscott, without Patton's competitive urgency and his operational direction of the amphibious hooks, might have reached Messina after Montgomery, might have fought the direct advance along the coastal road without the flanking operations, whose audacity was the product of Patton's willingness to accept the risk. The race required both. The German force defending the northern coastal road is the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division under General Walter Fries, one of the Wehrmacht's most professional mobile infantry formations, whose soldiers have been fighting in the Mediterranean theater since North Africa, and whose experience in the fighting withdrawal across the desert's open terrain and now along the Sicilian coast's compressed and vertical terrain has been building the specific and practical expertise in the delayed defensive withdrawal that the northern coastal road's defense requires. The 29th Panzer Grenadiers' specific and documented expertise in the fighting withdrawal, the tactical art of extracting a formation from a prepared defensive position at the precise moment when the attacker's pressure would otherwise produce encirclement, while maintaining the formation's coherence and its combat effectiveness for the next defensive position, has been converting the Sicilian coastal road's terrain into the most effective defensive operation available from the limited forces that the German command in Sicily has been able to commit to the northern sector. Fries has been demolishing the road in the systematic and professional way of a German engineer officer who has studied the terrain and identified every point where the cliffs make bypass impossible, and the road's demolition therefore creates the maximum delay, blowing the bridges whose spans have been the product of Italian military engineering from the 1930s, cratering the road surface at the tunnels and the switchbacks and the cliff-edge sections where the geography makes the crater irreplaceable, mining the approaches to each defensive position with the specific and professional knowledge of how to place mines where the American engineers, who will eventually clear them, will take the most time, and positioning his rearguard elements in the ridgelines above the road, and the village positions that command the road from above, in the specific and documented way of a commander who is using the terrain's vertical relief as the multiplier of the small force's defensive effectiveness. His assessment of the American 3rd Infantry Division's pursuit pace, documented in the after-action reports that survived the campaign, and in the post-war foreign military studies interviews, whose candor reflects the professional respect of a German officer, describing an opponent who has outperformed the professional expectation, is the professional assessment of a German officer who respects the force he is fighting and who has been consistently surprised by the pace that the division maintains, despite the terrain and the rearguard's best efforts. Surprised not because the 3rd Division is performing beyond the capacity that its training should theoretically permit, but because the German professionals' assessment of what the American Army's training could produce in a sustained operational environment had been based on the Kasserine Pass's evidence rather than the evidence the 3rd Division is now providing. The question, in the second week of August 1943, is whether Truscott's 3rd Infantry Division can cover 100 miles of the most difficult coastal terrain in the Mediterranean in the time available before the Sicilian campaign's operational window closes and the German evacuation completes. Before Operation Lehrgang's ferries and barges and assault craft finish moving the 40,000 German soldiers across the 3-mile Strait of Messina to the Italian mainland, and before the race becomes an exercise in capturing an empty city whose military content has been removed to fight the next campaign. August 7 through 8, 1943. Truscott's division is pressing east along Route 113, at the pace whose maintenance the 30th Infantry Regiment's lead elements are producing, at the cost of soldiers who have been marching and fighting without adequate rest since the campaign began, and whose physical reserves are being drawn down at the specific rate that sustained infantry combat in 100-degree heat against a professional rearguard produces. The road is a military engineer's nightmare and a defending general's gift. It follows the coastline's contours through the specific and compressed terrain of a Sicilian coastal road whose designers had civilian transport, not military pursuit operations, in mind when they traced the route along the cliff faces rather than the straight line that operational momentum requires. The road clings to cliffs whose face drops directly to the Tyrrhenian Sea on the south side and rises to the ridgelines on the north side, where the 29th Panzer Grenadiers rearguard has been positioning its blocking forces in the specific and professional way of a formation that has been reading this terrain for months and knows it better than the American force pursuing it. The Tyrrhenian in August is intensely blue and deeply irrelevant to the soldiers on the road above it, though it will become operationally relevant in 3 days when Truscott and Patton use it as the axis of the amphibious hook, who are thinking about the German position in the next village, and the bridge that the engineers say has been blown, and the replacement route that does not exist because the cliffs allow no bypass. The 3rd Division's soldiers are eating their way through the demolitions and the blocking positions one by one in the specific and grinding way of infantry combat in difficult terrain. The engineers bridging the craters whose reconstruction requires the specific and physical labor of soldiers who have been doing this since July 10th. The infantry flanking the village positions in the specific and exhausting way of soldiers who must climb the ridges above the road to get above a blocking position, and then descend behind it, and then repeat the climb at the next position 3 kilometers further east in the Sicilian August heat. The pace is extraordinary by any professional military's standard calculation of what a force can achieve in these conditions. It is also consuming the division's soldiers at a rate that the operational schedule cannot sustain indefinitely, consuming not only the physical strength of the men in the forward positions, but the specific and limited supply of the engineers' bridging equipment, whose availability constrains how fast the demolitions can be cleared. August 8, 1943. The first amphibious hook. Truscott and Patton have identified the solution to the terrain's constraint on the coastal road's pace. If the road's demolitions and blocking positions make the direct advance too slow, go around them by sea. The Tyrrhenian Sea that has been irrelevant to the soldiers on the road above it becomes the operational instrument of the bypass that the cliffs deny on land. Landing craft are available in the Sicilian coastal waters. The Tyrrhenian coast provides the beaches whose gradients permit the landing. The German rearguard's positions are oriented to defend along the road and cannot quickly reorient to defend the coastal flanks. On August 8th, Patton orders the 1st Amphibious Hook, a task force built around the 2nd Battalion, 30th Infantry Regiment, under Lieutenant Colonel Lyle Bernard, is loaded onto landing craft in the darkness and put ashore at Sant'Agata di Militello, 8 miles east of the German blocking position that has been stopping the 3rd Division's direct advance on Route 113. The landing force moves inland from the beach, in the specific and tactically demanding way of soldiers who must establish a defensive position and cut a road before the German reaction force can find them and destroy them, moving fast, moving quietly, moving in the knowledge that the hours before dawn are the hours when the advantage of surprise is available, and that the hours after dawn are the hours when the German position-finding and counterattack machinery will make the landing force's isolated position increasingly expensive. The landing force cuts the road behind the German blocking position and threatens to encircle the German rearguard, forces the specific and professional response of the German commander, who must choose between holding a position that has now been bypassed and losing the formation to encirclement, or withdrawing east to the next defensive line while the withdrawal route is still open. The German commander withdraws, as the professional calculation of encirclement versus displacement always produces the withdrawal. The loss of the defended ground is the acceptable cost, whose alternative is the loss of the formation. The 3rd Division's advance on the main road resumes. August 11th, 1943. The 2nd Amphibious Hook at Brolo. The near failure of the race to Messina arrives in the specific and documented form of this landing's near disaster. The operation that Patton orders over Truscott's professional objections in the most direct and documented command conflict of the Sicilian campaign. Truscott believes the timing is wrong, and the belief is grounded in the specific and professional calculation of a division commander who knows where his lead elements are on the road and has calculated how long it will take them to reach Brolo and what the German reaction force will have done to Bernard's landing battalion in the interval between the landing and the relief. The main force on the road is not close enough to link up with the landing force before the German reaction force can destroy it. He tells Patton directly and formally. At the command conference, whose discussion the participants will document in their memoirs, with the specific and professional language of men who remember the argument, because its stakes were the lives of the soldiers in the landing force. Patton orders the operation anyway, driven by the competitive urgency of the race whose stakes he has been calculating since the Palermo capture, and whose timeline is not elastic. Bernard's battalion goes in at Brolo, lands in the darkness, moves inland, cuts the road, and establishes the blocking position that is supposed to force the German rearguard's withdrawal. And then the German reaction arrives. The 29th Panzer Grenadiers commander, General Fries, recognizes the threat immediately and commits the reserves that the German rearguard has been holding for exactly this contingency. The counterattack against the amphibious landing force that can destroy the landing force before the main advance on the road arrives to relieve it. Bernard's battalion is hit from multiple directions by the German counterattack. German infantry attacking from the ridgelines above the landing site. German armor pressing from the east on the road that the battalion is blocking. The specific and visceral pressure of a force that is surrounded and that is being compressed from multiple directions by an opponent who knows the terrain and has the firepower to exploit the landing force's isolation. The battalion holds. But it holds at cost. 36 American soldiers killed and 157 wounded in the fighting around Brolo, and the main force on the road does not arrive until the next day, August 12, when the German rearguard has already exploited the window to withdraw east and establish the next defensive line. The Brolo hook does not fail. It achieves the forced withdrawal that the amphibious strategy requires. But the cost and the timing are the cost and the timing that Truscott's professional objection predicted, and the race's pace has been slowed by the gap between Patton's operational urgency and the tactical reality that the professional commander on the ground has been reading accurately. August 15 to 16, 1943. The third and final amphibious hook at Barcelona, the operation that will unlock the road to Messina, and whose execution represents the operational learning that the Brolo near failure has produced. This time, the coordination between the landing force and the main road advance is tighter, with Truscott's explicit insistence on the specific timeline whose maintenance the Brolo experience demonstrated as the critical variable. The coordination between the landing force's capacity to hold its blocking position and the main force's arrival at the landing site before the German counterattack force can destroy the landing force. The lessons of the Brolo operation have been incorporated not as a staff planning improvement, but as a professional judgment that the commander on the ground has earned the authority to impose on the operational timeline. The 7th Infantry Regiment's 2nd Battalion lands at Barcelona on the night of August 15th to 16th, 14 miles west of Messina, cuts the coast road behind the German defensive position that has been checking the main advance, and this time, the main force on the road is close enough behind the landing that the German rearguard cannot mount the sustained counterattack that the Brolo position's geography and the earlier timing had permitted. The 29th Panzer Grenadiers rearguard withdraws east toward the strait and the ferries that have been running since August 11th, withdraws in the specific and final phase of the fighting withdrawal whose professional execution has been extracting the German force from Sicily since the campaign began, moving the formation across the strait before the American advance can pin it against the water. The road east is open, and now the race's final phase is purely a question of physical pace. How fast can the 3rd Infantry Division's lead elements cover the 14 miles between Barcelona and the city of Messina, whose capture will be the campaign's conclusion, before the British 8th Army, pressing north along the eastern coastal road from the Catania Plain and around the base of Mount Etna, arrives from the other direction. August 17th, 1943. The 3rd Infantry Division's advance elements enter Messina at 1,000 hours. The lead soldiers of the 7th Infantry Regiment moving through streets that still carry the smoke of the German demolitions executed during the night. The systematic destruction of the port equipment and the road infrastructure and the fuel storage that the German evacuation plan has been prescribing as the standard denial procedure for the port being abandoned. The city is empty of German soldiers. The evacuation, Operation Lehrgang, Vice Admiral Friedrich Karl Bader's systematic and professionally managed crossing of the Strait of Messina's 3-mile water gap that has been running since August 11th, has been completed before the American forces arrived. 3 hours later, at approximately 1300 hours on August 17th, the leading elements of the 5th Canadian Armoured Division and the 4th British Armoured Brigade arrive from the south. The specific and documented arrival that the race's record shows as 3 hours after the 3rd Infantry Division's entry. In the city whose streets the 7th Infantry Regiment's soldiers have been occupying, while the 7th Army's command has been documenting the American arrival's timing with the professional thoroughness of a command that knows it has won a race and wants the record to reflect the margin. The race is over. The Americans won by the margin of 3 hours. 3 hours in a race that began when Alexander's July 25 directive gave Patton the northern road, and whose conclusion validates every professional assessment that Truscott and Patton have been making about the 3rd Infantry Division's operational capability since the division's formation. Patton arrives in Messina at 10:22 and surveys the Strait of Messina with the specific and personal satisfaction of a man who has been keeping score since the Husky Plan assigned his army the secondary mission, and whose scorekeeping has been validated by the operational record of the previous 38 days. He looks across 3 miles of blue water at Italy, at the Calabrian coast that the next Allied campaign will assault in September, at the terrain whose defense will occupy the Allied armies for the next 2 years. The cameras are there. Patton has understood since Palermo that the visual record of the campaign's conclusion is a strategic communication, and the photographs that will document the Messina moment will travel through the Allied press corps to the American public in the specific and intended way of a military command that knows how to manage the narrative of its own operational success. The photographs will be taken, the narrative will be managed. And the German evacuation, Operation Lehrgang's transport of approximately 40,000 German soldiers and 10,000 vehicles across the Strait of Messina to the Italian mainland, whose completion before the American arrival represents the campaign's most significant strategic failure, will be assessed separately in the post-war reviews that document what Bader's operation accomplished, while the two Allied armies were racing each other to the city. The legacy of the 100-mile race to Messina, the advance that the German professional command said an American army could never sustain at that pace, through that terrain, against that rearguard, whose professional quality and whose knowledge of the terrain made every kilometer of the coastal road the maximum defensible kilometer available, is the legacy of a demonstration whose importance exceeds the tactical satisfaction of arriving 3 hours before the British, and whose professional significance the post-war assessments of the Sicilian campaign consistently identify as the most operationally instructive element of the entire Mediterranean theater's 1943 operations. The 3rd Infantry Division covered the coastal road from Santo Stefano to Messina in 10 days, 100 miles through the most difficult coastal terrain in the Mediterranean, terrain that the German 29th Panzer Grenadiers commander assessed as favorable to the defender, and that the professional military's standard calculation of what an infantry division can achieve in road-bound mountain terrain, in extreme heat against a prepared rearguard, assessed as a week's advance at best. It did so against one of the Wehrmacht's most professional mobile formations, the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division, whose fighting withdrawal from the landing beaches to the Strait of Messina is one of the most professionally executed delaying operations in the entire Western Allied theater, executing 3 amphibious hooks whose tactical audacity compensated for the terrain's constraints, maintaining the march pace that Truscott had been training his division to sustain since 1942, and doing it in the Sicilian August, whose heat and dust and physical demands have been producing the specific and documented physical degradation of soldiers who have been in continuous operations for 5 weeks, without the rest that the standard military planning cycle assumes as the baseline for sustained operational performance. The 3rd Division lost approximately 1,600 killed and wounded in the Sicilian campaign, casualties whose accumulation across 38 days of operations against the Italian and German forces that the campaign has been reducing confirms the advance's genuine operational cost, and whose distribution across the campaigns. Duration reflects the specific pattern of the sustained operations, whose cost the Truscott-Trott's pace was never designed to eliminate, but only to redistribute from the casualties of slower advance to the casualties of faster advance, in terrain where speed itself reduces the exposure time to the defender's fire. The campaign captured or neutralized approximately 113,000 Axis prisoners across the 38-day operation, an accounting that includes the Italian formations, whose surrender contributed the largest portion of the prisoner count, and the German formations whose resistance contributed the largest portion of the American casualties and whose professional performance in the fighting, withdrawal from the landing beaches to the strait, provided the specific and documented evidence that the German army's operational quality in 1943 remained the standard against which the American army was measuring its own development. The campaign drove the Axis out of Sicily in 38 days, setting the conditions for the Italian mainland campaign, whose September landing at Salerno would be enabled by the Sicilian campaign's clearing of the southern approaches, and contributing to the internal Italian political pressure that produced Mussolini's removal from power on July 25, 1943, a strategic consequence whose timing was not coincident with the campaign's progress, but was influenced by the military situation's deterioration. The German command's professional assessment that an American army could not sustain the pace and the operational intensity that the race to Messina required was wrong. Wrong not in the way of a professional assessment that failed to account for a known variable, but in the way of a professional assessment that failed to account for a training program whose specific and operational implications had not yet been tested in a sustained campaign when the assessment was formed. The assessment was based on what the American army had been in Tunisia, at Kasserine, in the early operations of the Mediterranean theater, when the institutional learning was still building. It did not account for what the American army had become by August 1943. What a year of Truscott's training had produced in the 3rd Infantry Division's soldiers, and what 5 weeks of Sicilian combat had tempered into the specific and hardened operational capability that the race's final 10 days required. The Truscott Trot, the pace that seemed like a training affectation when Truscott imposed it on soldiers who had not yet been tested, was the operational instrument that validated the race's result, and its validation was the specific and personal professional achievement of a commander who had been building toward this race since 1942 without knowing that the race was what he was building toward. The American soldier who covered 100 miles in 10 days did not know, when he trained for it in the pre-campaign exercises where Truscott ran him at 5 miles per hour through the training areas and demanded more pace and more distance and more endurance than the standard army training required, what he was training for. He found out in August 1943, on the road above the Tyrrhenian Sea, in the dust and the heat and the specific and grinding exhaustion of the soldier who has been fighting for 38 days without rest, and who is still moving faster than anyone said he could, toward a city that the German professional command said he would not reach first, and that the British operational plan did not assign him as his primary objective, and reaching it 3 hours before the British, in the specific and irreversible evidence that the professional calculation that built the Kasserine Pass story around the American soldier's limitations had been wrong about what the American soldier could do from the very beginning.